My TLDR for June 30th BNR, Monstrous Rage is banned, no other changes in Standard. Why do I think this? Find out right now. Standard bans have been discussed for what seems like almost a year at this point, with cards from Up the Beanstalk to This Town Ain't Big Enough, and most recently Cori-Steel Cutter being targets of conversations as the Standard metagame has kind of bobbed and weaved between set releases and large events. Specifically, the amount of regional championships and then the most recent Pro Tour Final Fantasy that was had. We had a slew of big high-level events to give us a lot of different things to talk about when it comes to Standard. But overall, I only think that one card out of all of these could potentially be worth hitting with the ban hammer on June 30th. So in this video, the topics I'm going to talk about is why do I think only Monstrous Rage should be banned? If you just came for that from the video, there you go. Have fun. But also why each of these popular targets that people are talking about across social media, I want to talk about why I don't think that they should be banned outright. Cori-Steel Cutter, Manifold Mouse, Up the Beanstalk, and This Town Ain't Big Enough. Then I'm going to switch gears a tiny bit and talk about how I think the ban structure and overall structure of Standard actually make conversations like this a little bit more difficult or awkward than if it was tweaked around a little bit. And then also touching upon the upcoming Standard events, because there are still two pretty big events coming up relatively soon at Magic Spotlight Series in Chiba, Japan, which is happening this weekend actually, and then the Magic Spotlight Series with Edge of Eternities at the end of August in Orlando, Florida, and then kind of looking at what we can expect from Standard in those upcoming times. So starting everything off is Monstrous Rage, a card that has been on a lot of different people's radar, especially after the most recent Pro Tour Final Fantasy. Monstrous Rage is a 1 red mana instant speed spell, which gives target creature +2/+0 until end of turn, which doesn't seem like a lot. However, it also creates a monster role token and attaches it to the targeted creature, which does say that this creature has +1/+1 and the trample keyword. Now, this card is in a lot of people's discussions because it is problematic due to the low cost or problematic due to the amount of power that it winds up giving, when in reality, we have other cards that have existed just like this spell. One of them is actually Standard legal right now. Now, Titan Strength does exactly what Monstrous Rage does, only it scries instead of giving trample, while Turn Inside Out does not give the +1 to the toughness that the role token from Monstrous Rage does, but that card almost sees zero play. We've had a harmonized version of this card also be printed very recently, which did see a little bit of play at the Pro Tour, but in a combo-centric deck and not a straight-up aggro one. So why were these cards not issues, but absolutely everybody that has any gripes with the red deck specifically, why are they talking about Monstrous Rage and talking about banning this card? And why do I feel like that this is the one card that should get banned from Standard? Well, the biggest thing is the role token. The fact that the role token persists after casting this card is the most problematic part of this card, because the persistence of having trample puts opponents in way more awkward positions than if this was just a one-time pump spell like Dreadmaw's Ire that I've seen people throwing around as a potential replacement for this card. Trample is extremely strong in the mono red aggro deck. So much so that sometimes people forget that Manifold Mouse has the ability to give trample as well, and they don't even use it until there's multiple copies of it because Monstrous Rage takes care of that line of thinking for them. It's also okay in the prowess decks, but even better in the prowess decks that aren't running VV and Thunder Trap trainers and bounce spell kind of packages. It is way better in the package of Monastery Swiftspear and Slickshot Show Off, where this one toughness, in addition to prowess on Swiftspear or the pseudo prowess on the Slickshot Show Off, winds up putting it out of shock range entirely. So this card in and of itself, the persistence of the role token is the main reason why it winds up being way more problematic than everything else. Now, this card is present in the most different archetypes than any other card on this list, besides maybe This Town Ain't Big Enough, but we'll talk about how much we actually see that card when we get to it. So Prowess does wind up running a little bit less of this card, especially when Prowess kind of shifts into more of the mid-rangey value style, especially with the introduction of Vivi into the list. But Mono Red usually winds up running the max amount of Monstrous Rages most of the time. So hitting Monstrous Rage takes two of these top decks in the format that have been there since basically Bologna at the end of April and takes them both down a notch, which means that it's going to affect the most in the metagame of Standard. So this card winds up being extremely huge in the mono red deck, specifically because of Valiant. And like I said, it puts things out of shock range, and it combines amazingly with other cards that are in these packages. Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, and Vivi out of the mono red and Prowess decks play so well with Monstrous Rage, and keeping that extra +1/+1 around means that these things get bigger and bigger, faster and faster. So overall, I think that Monstrous Rage is the main card that you want to hit because it nerfs multiple decks while not straight up removing them from the metagame, as they do wind up having other cards that they can replace this with, whether it be Wild Ride, Turn Inside Out, or something else. And so while both decks do survive, I think this ban affects mono red a little bit more than Prowess, which after the results at PT Final Fantasy looks like exactly how you want to approach nerfing the metagame for this current Standard format. Cori-Steel Cutter is another hot topic of conversation, as this card was slept on during spoiler season, but it didn't take Standard pilots that long to figure out exactly how cracked the cutter was. Now, Cori-Steel Cutter is a 1/1 red, so a 2 converted mana cost overall artifact equipment, which says that the equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and haste. That's already pretty solid, but you gotta put it on something, right? Well, Cori-Steel Cutter has this flavorful mechanic that is named Flurry, which is from the Jeskai tribe in Tarkir Dragonstorm, which says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with Prowess. You may attach this equipment to it, and then you can of course just re-equip the Cori-Steel Cutter for the cost of 1/1 red. So yeah, this card winds up doing a ton of different things. Just looking at how much text is on the card, you don't even get a little flavor quote or anything like that, because the card is just chock full of text on the card that tells you exactly what it does. So while this card seems like a jack of all trades for everything, it only really goes in one specific deck where it is a problem to deal with. Now, this card in and of itself has the fact that the Prowess shell is specifically designed to work with this card. And I'm not saying like, oh, the Prowess deck was built around Cori-Steel Cutter. I mean, versions of the Prowess deck already existed before Cori-Steel Cutter was printed, and then Cori-Steel Cutter just so happened to fit specifically into that shell and give this deck an angle of attack that it just completely lacked, because, you know, normally you have like a young Pyromancer or a Monastery Mentor or the Third Path Iconoclast. Is you need to have another thing that is like targetable by burn spells or, you know, just targeted creature removal early on, even low cost mono ones, in order to create like an army of tokens. And in doing so, the plus side of that is like you get to do it every single time. But regardless of that, Cori-Steel Cutter is a product of the Standard card pool, and I do think that the largeness and vastness of Standard is partly the blame for how powerful this card actually is. Now, one of the best pairings of Cori-Steel Cutter in the Prowess deck are the 1 mana cantrip spells. Sleight of Hand and Opt are the best things to pair with Cori-Steel Cutter because, well, taking a look at it, I mean, these cards are just absolutely good to cantrip through your deck when you want to cast multiple spells. And when you play Cori-Steel as your 2 mana spell and then follow it up with a 1 mana cantrip, you just immediately make a monk token while also advancing through your deck to set up your play for next turn. Now, one of the problems about this is with the way that Standard is set up now, and some of these sets wind up lasting 3 years, Sleight of Hand and Opt are both going to stay in the format through rotation, whereas I'm not 100% sure on this, and I can't really find any resources for it, but since Wilds of Eldraine came out in 2023, Sleight of Hand was in that set, and I believe that Sleight of Hand would have rotated with the rest of the rotation coming out if we didn't have the 3-year window of Standard now. So having this large card pool is partially to blame for Cori-Steel Cutter staying as effective as it's going to be in the next couple of months if it doesn't wind up getting the ban hammer. Now, because this card works only once per turn, it seems like it would be fine, but the card makes this go wide angle happen in these prowess decks that I mentioned before briefly. It doesn't really come up. You need a young Pyromancer or some sort of other creature-based threat or something you devote a bunch of mana into, and then those tokens don't grow or anything like that. Or you need to have a higher mana cost thing like a Monastery Mentor and then wind up being in white in addition to this in order to create these 1/1 prowess monk tokens. So even though, you know, you have the quote-unquote Nadu failsafe of this only happening once per turn, you still wind up creating a token every single turn. And unlike those young Pyromancers and Monastery Mentors, if you play a board wipe against Cori-Steel Cutter, you get rid of all the tokens, but you don't get rid of the Cori-Steel Cutter. Well, at least until you play Ultima, like some of the people did at the Pro Tour this past weekend. But by leaving that Cori-Steel Cutter behind, while the deck is naturally trying to restock its hand and board state, you're going to be creating additional monk tokens. And even if you don't have a board wipe and you just have targeted removal, well, tough luck for you. This deck is running so many token generators that you're not really getting bang for your buck by binning a creature. You're just killing tokens and stuff with your 1-for-1 removal spells, and Cori-Steel Cutter is continuing to make replacement ones every single turn. The fact of the matter is that this now also hops onto one of those tokens, gives it +1/+1, and haste. So if you're able to cast a third spell on the turn with the prowess trigger, you're getting a 3/3 just for casting 3 1-mana spells, and a 3/3 for 3 in limited is an amazing rate. When you have that plus another 1/1 plus another 1/1 from your Storm Chasers talent before, you can see how problematic about this card is in these style of decks. So it does kind of seem like Cutter is a harder to answer card, because in order to do so, you either need to ignore the token or ignore the Cori-Steel Cutter and answer what's in front of you, what you have, and it always seems like that you're going to have to 2-for-1 yourself effectively and go down a card when placing against it. The fact of the matter is Cori-Steel Cutter does not just get thrown down on turn 2 and left there very frequently, especially if you are playing a green or red deck. Your opponent knows that you're going to have an answer to this thing, so you can wait until turn 3, immediately cast another spell because you have the priority, and it's going to trigger on cast. You get the token anyway, so even if you kill the Cori-Steel Cutter, there's a monk token that gets left behind, and you still get to cast your third spell for the turn. So giving it haste, giving it trample, +1/+1, prowess, this card does seem extremely problematic and seems like it just does everything. So like, why do I think after going through all of that this card should not be banned overall? Well, the biggest thing about this one is it's not the strongest argument, but I think because it only goes in one specific deck, which is the Izzet Prowess deck, and specifically Prowess, not the VV Combo or VV Cauldron decks, I'm not a huge fan of taking Cori-Steel Cutter out to try to just quote-unquote kill the deck. Now, the VV Cauldron deck has no cutter, and it just combos off through Astrologian's Planisphere, is the name of the card, which kind of does something very similar to Cori-Steel Cutter, but that creature keeps growing and growing and growing over time, and it goes tall instead of going wide, so your 1-for-1 removal is a little bit better into it, but your low-cost spells like Cut Down and stuff are not as effective because that thing's going to get huge pretty quickly. And then the versions of Prowess that are running things like Slick Shot Show Off, you lose the Cori-Steel Cutter, but if you're playing Storm Chasers Talent, Monastery Swift Spear, and then Slick Shot Show Off, you still have a Prowess package that's going to kill you pretty darn quick and can go somewhat wide still, especially when you have the plot factor of the Slick Shot Show Off in. So Cori-Steel Cutter is a very, very powerful card, but I would prefer to pick a card that is shared between multiple decks, especially because these two top tier decks, Mono Red and Izzet Prowess, share a color and share some spells. So if Prowess wound up being a higher win rate at the Pro Tour instead of being like a 48.8 non-mirror win rate deck, I think I would feel differently about putting the Banhammer on Cori-Steel Cutter. And I also feel like this is a case of targeting the wrong card when the meta is already adapting to it. So banning Cori-Steel Cutter just kind of kneecaps the Is It Prowess deck and just shifts them over to the VV combo deck, or shifts them over to the way more aggressive Slick Shot Show-Off version of the deck instead of allowing the deck to try to come up with answers of its own to what the metagame is doing to combat it. So I think overall, Cori-Steel Cutter, wrong card to hit because it only targets one specific deck, and even that specific deck could just shift to not running it and potentially not lose any power. Manifold Mouse is one of the cards that I didn't think all too much about, but I saw a lot of people start calling out, potentially because of the results of the Pro Tour this past weekend. But this little 2 mana cost mouse, just 1/1 red, has a lot of text on it as well. You can cast it for its offspring cost, so 4 mana altogether, to create a additional 1/1 token copy of it when you cast this spell. So that, and you wind up getting 2 Manifold Mice. One is a 1/2 and one is a 1/1. But the biggest part about this Manifold Mouse is just the beginning of combat triggered ability, which is at the beginning of combat on your turn, target mouse you control, so it has to be a mouse, gains your choice of Double Strike or Trample until end of turn. So overall, the mouse package in Standard, and even in Pioneer at this point, is incredibly strong, to the point where aggro decks in these formats just kind of feel like Bloomburrow block constructed decks. So Emberheart Challenger and Manifold Mouse are the 2/2 drops that really kind of push the deck a little bit further in different directions. Now, Emberheart Challenger gives the deck a little bit of longevity because you wind up having an impulse type effect. So when you target it with its Valiant ability, it exiles the top card of your library, and you're able to kind of dig a little deeper and give your deck a little bit of card velocity that mono red normally doesn't have. But Manifold Mouse is the one that people really feel slighted by, because it does things like enabling potential turn 3 kills when your opponent has no interaction. Now, I can walk you through one of the ways that this happens, which is turn 1, you play Heartfire Hero, another part of that mouse package. Turn 2, you play your Manifold Mouse. When you target your Heartfire Hero, it triggers the Valiant ability of Heartfire Hero. So now you give your Heartfire Hero Double Strike on turn 2 if you're on the play. Very unlikely your opponent has anything to block it on turn 1, so that's going to be 4 double striking damage coming across from the Heartfire Hero right away. Now you untap on turn number 3, you wind up playing a pump spell like Monstrous Rage, which winds up then triggering the Valiant ability on the Heartfire Hero, and then puts it up to 3 power, and then gives it an additional +2/+0 and the roll token. So now you're up to a 6 power Heartfire Hero. Targeting it with Manifold Mouse now makes it a double striker, so there's 12 damage coming out from the Heartfire Hero all by itself, which with the previous 4 puts us at 16 total damage. So if you have a combination of 2 more 1 mana spells, like a Monastery Swift Spear and a Burst Lightning, that's 4 damage. Whoa! Or if you have 4 additional power of pump spells, or like a +2 effect and a Burst Lightning, that's going to be exactly 20 damage. So Manifold Mouse has these solitaire type draws that wind up feeling really bad for your opponents when they're playing slower styles of deck, or when they basically eventually get brought with the choice of being unable to block anymore. Now, Heartfire Hero getting trample from Monstrous Rage is a big problem, because even if at any point in time you don't have those spells from that previous turn 3 kill example, or they're able to deal with something along the lines of killing the Monastery Swift Spear, or you don't have the Burst Lightning damage or something, maybe you have a blocker that's able to absorb a little bit of the damage that the Heartfire Hero is trampling over with. The Heartfire Hero is growing every single time. The Manifold Mouse is targeting it every single turn, which is putting an additional counter on it. Even if they just have those 2 mice, I've already talked about it being 16 damage. That Manifold Mouse is now a 3/3 has a roll token, which makes it 4/4. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You need to make sure you can absorb 3 of the 4 damage, which is potentially going to be more with the double strike from the Manifold Mouse the next turn, because if you try to kill it or you block it and it dies in combat, you just straight up die from the Heartfire Hero's Dies ability. So this whole package of cards makes this Manifold Mouse the target of everybody's ire for it being the most problematic part about it. Now, While Manifold Mouse is a very important part of this mouse package, I do want to kind of take a step back and talk about aggro as a whole in the format, because for a very long time, what people seem to forget is that the red decks were borderline unplayable. You had Urabrass Forge and Godric the Reveler and, these decks that were trying to get there. And when Monastery Swiftspear came out, people were like, yes, maybe aggro decks are going to be saved finally. And it turns out like they weren't. But the mouse package is basically holding mono red or aggro decks in general together in the format. And other versions of aggro are just straight up not viable. And it's not because the mouse package is actually just blocking them out and just strictly like beating up these other aggro versions, which could potentially be part of the reason why the mouse package is very strong. So why would you want to play something different? But the fact of the matter is that these other versions of the aggro decks that we've gone through other iterations of just are not good against the decks in the metagame. I mean, we had mono red versions of the aggro deck that were more prowessy, like I talked about with Monastery Swiftspear. They used like Fugitive Codebreaker back in the day, and you have versions of that deck that could potentially be built now, but it's just a worse version of playing Izzet Prowess because you don't have ways to bounce things out of the way, or you need to potentially like use Shock or something as your 1-mana burn spell in addition to Burst Lightning, which has been printed now to try to push through extra damage, and the quality of your cards is overall just worse than playing the mouse package. You had mono red or Rakdos Lizards, which was popular for like 10 days or something like that before the deck just got completely phased out because it was way too creature dependent. The creatures weren't hasty. They didn't have all these different effects. You put some things on the board and it was way too susceptible to board wipes and targeted removal. And then we have decks like the Boros Burn version of aggro, where we literally have a Lightning Bolt variant in Standard, which is Bolt Wave, so it doesn't hit creatures, but it hits face for the same amount. We also have Lightning Helix and Boros Charm. All three of these types of effects, Lava Spike, Boros Charm, and Lightning Helix, made Modern Burn a deck to play. There's a big reason for that. We even have Monastery Swiftspear, which was in Modern Burn, but when push comes to shove, that deck is not good in the current Standard metagame, whether it be due to the mana base, whether it be due to not having the same type of threat as like a Ragavan or the Goblin guy. I couldn't remember the name of that card for some reason. I was like ranting about it, but having these other creatures to back up that plan just isn't there. So we do wind up even seeing like the Boros versions of this style of deck playing the mouse package and then killing people on top with the burn package, which still isn't as good. It's just playing straight up mono red. So at the end of the day, if you ban Manifold Mouse, it seems like you just ban mono red aggro from the metagame in general. Other versions are going to try to see play, but slow the deck down a ton. Splashing other colors or giving higher RNG, like going back to the Leyline of Resonance mono red style or Rakdos style decks, is not going to be as good. Hell, I don't even know if you would play Heartfire Hero to make that Rakdos style of deck good again if you got rid of Manifold Mouse. Cacophony Scamp is going to rotate, so you lose the second one of those as well, so you're literally just stuck with this Heartfire Hero that you're not really going to be able to target with anything besides your pump spells or if you play Rockface Village, right? So all of these other versions seem much worse, and I think if you are a mono red player, you just shift on over to Prowess because you have basically better 1-drops that just make token versions of all these cards. Now, red is one of the decks that is also keeping Izzet Prowess in check, so if you were to ban Manifold Mouse, you need to ban other things in the format as well, which seems like something I would do if this was still a problem in post-rotation Standard. Not a huge fan of banning like 2 to 3 cards right now because you've had one of your best-selling sets of all time in the Final Fantasy Universe Beyond set, and you have a rotation coming up in like less than 2 months now. So you have all these new players coming in. They see the Pro Tour. They're buying Final Fantasy stuff at the Pro Tour. None of these cards are Final Fantasy cards, but they start putting a Standard deck together with some of their favorite Final Fantasy characters. And then not only do you just ban some of those cards away entirely and churn them out before they even actually go to a LGS and play their local FNM, but now you're going to wind up completely changing the landscape of everything that they just bought into from watching the pros play that event. So they'll show up, things are completely different, and they're going to turn based off the fact that like the stuff that they bought just isn't viable, or they're contending against different types of things within the span of 1 week, and then looking at the game and being like, well, this changes too much for me. Why am I going to spend money on it? Now, I mean, those are all like outside of the game factor things. I think that Manifold Mouse is more fine as a card overall when the choice of its activated ability is more of a choice and not just straight default to double strike. I think that in my world where I'm banning Monstrous Rage, Manifold Mouse is perfectly fine, because in the scenario previously, where you wind up giving your Heartfire hero double strike and it's potentially dealing 12 damage on turn number 3, if you chump block it with a 1/1, that's perfectly fine, because now it doesn't have persistent trample effect. So now you're not going to be put in these awkward blocking situations where you chump block with a 1/1, you die to trample damage, you kill the thing, you die to its dies trigger or something like that. Basically, getting rid of Monstrous Rage makes blocking a viable option against this again, and then means that Manifold Mouse now has to start giving trample more frequently than double strike when the board is all gummed up with blockers and things like that, so that these Heartfire heroes can actually trample through damage and then explode on your opponent, forcing the mono red player to go down in resources in order to deal that effective same amount of damage, rather than just casting a Monstrous Rage and putting double strike on a Heartfire hero. So Manifold Mouse gets powered down without Monstrous Rage in the format, which is another reason why I think the Mouse should stay and the Rage should go. Now, one of the cards that's been thrown around in ban conversation for a long time and actually got banned in Modern is Up the Beanstalk, and I can't get behind this with everybody, I'm sorry. But Up the Beanstalk is a 1/1 green, so 2 total converted mana cost enchantment, and when Up the Beanstalk enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you get to draw a card. Now, I'm not really sure why this card gets so much hate, because at face value, this card doesn't really do much. This card is an engine card. You need to have a deck built around this card, and then you need to draw this card in that engine deck in order to get the card to be worth even running. So in general, this card needs like the Duskmourn Overlords for it really to pop off, or it needs like these high mana cost things with cost reduction that doesn't actually affect their CMC overall, like Leyline Binding and Ridezen, to really function as a deck. So people like to argue all the time that in order to play around Up the Beanstalk, you have to go down in cards to answer it, because when this enters, it cantrip, so it replaces itself. But when I'm looking at a deck that uses an engine card to function as a deck, answering the engine is oftentimes way more worth the 1-for-1 or 1.5-for-1 or two, however you want to say it, 2-for-1 of your resources to stall that deck on what it wants to do. I've played so much Rakdos Sacrifice. When you kill the Witch's Oven, when you exile a Cauldron Familiar, or you just get rid of your Mayhem Devil, that deck ceases to function the way that it wants to and has to play a subpar Rakdos mid-range game. If you answer an Up the Beanstalk deck that doesn't immediately have a replacement Up the Beanstalk and just has to play Impending Overlords the fair way, that deck doesn't do anything. So if I were to just tear asunder your Up the Beanstalk, or, you know, utilize like not Molt Tender, but like the Insidious Fungus or one of those Cankerbloom type effects on your Up the Beanstalk, I think that's pretty value. And this is also sort of the same kind of thing where people lump Up the Beanstalk in the conversation with Cori-Steel Cutter, where it comes to like having a difficult time answering the card. And I just don't entirely buy that kind of argument. I just think that Up the Beanstalk and Cori-Steel Cutter, when they're on the battlefield, do entirely different things, whereas Cori-Steel Cutter advances a game plan in a different angle. Up the Beanstalk is the game plan. And if you answer it, their game plan is kind of hindered a bit. Now, I think this is perfectly highlighted by the fact that Up the Beanstalk, being a card that needs deck to be built around it and is as strong as the surrounding cards, is highlighted in the fact that early on, decks like the Golgari ramp deck that was played at previous professional events were very awkward or very bad when they didn't have Up the Beanstalk or it got answered, unless your name is Seth Manfield, who could pretty much win a Pro Tour with a ham sandwich. Also, control shells like Azorius or Jeskai, they don't use this card whatsoever because it's not worth the while of building their deck in a way to enable Up the Beanstalk. We've even seen the Jeskai decks with Shiko completely shift their package to being mostly 3 mana or less things that Shiko can recur, and Up the Beanstalk needs it to be 5 or greater. So you can either have the Shiko Flashback package or the Up the Beanstalk 5 or greater package, and when push comes to shove, the control decks currently, they want to be recurring things like Temporary Lockdown, which doesn't play well without the Beanstalk, by the way. They want to be playing, you know, their removal spells and things like that to deal with these aggro decks. They don't need the Up the Beanstalk card advantage engine to do these things. So the decks that Up the Beanstalk would kind of be okay in don't even want the card. So this card only really works in Domain. It only really works with the Impending Overlords and Leyline Binding or Ride's End. And Domain is already losing a ton of valuable cards with rotation. You're losing Zur, which basically means that the Overlords are just impending cost cards and a little more fair. So yeah, they wind up triggering Up the Beanstalk when you play an Overlord of the Hauntwoods for 3 mana instead of 5, and you ramp yourself by 1 mana for the next turn, so you go up to 5, you can cast something different. But all it is the 3 mana, draw a card, put a land on the battlefield kind of thing, which like seems still pretty good at the end of the day. But if you kill that Up the Beanstalk, they're just playing a quote-unquote fair Impending Overlord, and the thing doesn't wind up attacking for multiple turns. Leyline Binding also leaves the format with rotation, making Ride's End the sole targeted removal spell, but it's for creatures only, which means that you're going to have to put other things in the deck to deal with permanents or deal with other types of cards that are not just creatures. At the end of the day as well, a lot of decks have been cutting down on Ride's End and putting in more sweepers, be it a Temporary Lockdown or Split Up type effect, Day of Judgment, or Ultima, because Ultima answers artifacts as well, which means that it's way better against the Cori-Steel Cutter decks and way better against any of the decks that are going to be putting incidental artifacts or things on the battlefield that you need to just get rid of entirely. So is Beans going to still be good after the rotation happens? I'm not entirely sure, because Domain might not even be a functional deck post-rotation. I know that there's the Yuna deck, which is sometimes Naya, sometimes Ban. They're still kind of figuring it out because it's not as good as Domain is right now, and Domain still isn't a very good deck right now. But the Yuna deck is much slower. You wind up playing like a reanimation angle from a lot of the packages that I've seen so far, or you just play a straight up fair mid-range value style game. And Yuna's like a 5 mana card. So yeah, it triggers up the Beanstalk in and of itself, but you're not doing things that Zur can do on turn 3-4 the same way with the Yuna deck, which means that the deck is just slower and gives you more time to answer its engine type cards. Now, and of course, there's also the fact that some of these reanimation spells like a Zombify or something don't even trigger up the Beanstalk. So you might not even want Up the Beanstalk in the Yuna version of the deck. Now, one deck that Up the Beanstalk does play very well with is the Tolarian Terror type deck, Simic and Sultai Terror, which use This Town Ain't Big Enough. This kind of seems like the most unfair use of the card, specifically existing post-rotation, but the deck only really has like 3 cards that trigger it. The Terror itself, This Town Ain't Big Enough, and Eddy Merc Crab, which you can just pick up and recast. Specifically the Eddy Merc Crab, being able to pick it up, recast it, and tap things down, pretty problematic, and you can just keep drawing cards. But you know, you're probably going to wind up Storm Chaser's talent looping them instead, so you continue to get the This Town Ain't Big Enough back, and then bouncing things like every other turn or every turn cycle on their attack step or something instead. So this seems like the best place for the card to exist, but it doesn't seem unfair at all in that deck, and I say that that's probably the most unfair deck to put it in. So I think Up the Beanstalk in general though is up at its best, up to its best, Up the Beanstalk up there, when the format is slower, more mid-rangey and grindy overall, like it was when people complained about it about a year ago or so. So if there are multiple bans that happen, like a ban in Prowess, a ban in Mono Red, not Monstrous Rage, because I think that doesn't really affect the speed of these decks in a part where Up the Beanstalk decks gain more than like an additional turn on their clock, which you can then, Day of Judgment or potentially Ultima with if you've overlorded the Hauntwoods previously. But I think if you ban something like Cori-Steel Cutter and Manifold Mouse, you then need to ban Up the Beanstalk, because overall, the format will slow down to a point where the soupy mid-range deck with the thing that gains value off of all the cards is going to cast, because it can impend Overlords, cast Yuna, cast Rides, and everything is basically 5 mana or higher except for Up the Beanstalk in the deck, and you can cheat on those costs. I think then Up the Beanstalk becomes a problem, but in my scenario where you just ban Monstrous Rage, Up the Beanstalk is a perfectly fine card to keep around. So if it was up to me, Up the Beanstalk would still be here. Tsutabe! This town ain't big enough. Took me longer than I want to admit to realize what that abbreviation actually stood for, but this 4-in-1 blue mana instant speed spell is on the problematic cards list for some people. Well, let's actually cut to the chase, because this is actually a 1-in-1 blue mana spell, because this spell will cost 3 less to cast if it targets a permanent that you control. Then you may return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So this is at its best in decks that have low mana targets that care about ETB effects, recasting their own spells, saving things from removal spells, or anything with Storm Chaser's talent in the deck, because this is a combo. You play the Storm Chaser's talent, you level it up to get your This Town Ain't Big Enough back after you've cast it once from your graveyard. You cast this town to bounce your Storm Chaser's talent and your opponent's best thing. You recast the Storm Chaser's talent, which is now reset to level 1, and you can buy back your This Town Ain't Big Enough, etc, etc, etc. So this is very good in decks like the Prowess deck, the Terror decks that we talked about just before, that the Beanstalk, the one where it really broke out, which was the Temur Otter combo deck, and some of the older Pixie bounce spell type shells. So the biggest thing is basically you loop this card with things like Storm Chaser's Talent, Hopeless Nightmare, etc, etc. But the loop of Storm Chaser's Talent and This Town Ain't Big Enough is only super problematic in decks like Temur Otters, where you basically make an infinite amount of mana, or some of the new VV decks where you could potentially make a virtually large amount of mana, where you could then This Town and Storm Chaser's Talent loop somebody of basically their whole board. Now, the card in general has been steadily declining in play for months. Orzhov Pixie, it cut the blue, so you don't run This Town Ain't Big Enough anymore. Esper Pixie, that deck fell off, so it wound up cutting some of those spells as well. You have Entity Trackers, you wind up having Optimistic Scavenger and those type cards instead, giving the deck a little bit more of an aggressive angle, and you don't need This Town when you have all these other self-bound spells in there. Prowess is also kind of split on if they want the card or not, because decks that are playing a little bit more aggressive, or even some of the VV Prowess decks, are just playing into the Flood Maw, and that works perfectly fine for them, and it's 1 mana cheaper, and you just basically cast it to bounce something problematic like a Temporary Lockdown, pop off and kill your opponent, or just bounce like their last remaining blocker so you can just wind up killing them. So 1 mana, way more efficient than the 2 mana for doing that, and you don't have to bounce your own thing. You can maybe gift them a fish if you really want to, but hey, whatever, it's a 1/1. You can trample over a Monstrous Rage, haha. Now, even if there are multiple bans in the format, this card just seems fine to keep around. Now, I know it's really annoying when you face against the card, specifically when you're behind. It feels like this card is just completely shutting you out of the game, but in the end of everything, it's kind of like a win more when you're already behind the deck that's running this type of card. But when you are ahead of the deck that is running this type of card, it feels way much better to play against, and it's just a minor annoyance. And on an even battlefield, when somebody can kind of use it effectively, I think it actually creates an interesting kind of play pattern and just like a good advantage that will tempo swing the other deck in its favor for casting a successfully maneuvered This Town Ain't Big Enough, which I think is exactly where the card wants to be. So there's also the fact that the format now has Spell Pierce, which was, I believe, introduced in Duskmorn. So this town ain't big enough hasn't been a real problem since the introduction of like lower mana cost interaction like that, because that makes like the early game this towns where you would like bounce a Storm Chaser's talent, replay it, make a Cori-Steel Cutter token or something like that on turn 3, not nearly as effective because you're spell piercing to this town ain't big enough early on, and then they have to wait a couple turns to invest mana into buying it back. And decks have been cutting the number of this towns anyway. Like even like a couple of regional championships ago, the decks that were running it were running like 1 or 2 copies, so it's a little bit more backbreaking if they lose their singleton copy and then have to go for like the buyback angle to do anything like that, versus decks that run the full 4 copies like the Otter combo deck that's like, well, I'm just gonna wait for my other one. So better interaction, less good in the metagame overall. I don't think that this card is a problem anymore. The town is finally big enough. Now, I don't think I would be as analytical and give a best explanation to my thought process if I didn't also kind of give some thoughts on the overall structure and like structure of ban windows and standard right now. I think that having a set announcement date that you do every single year is definitely cool for buyers and collectors of the format who are going to be playing kind of tangentially. But overall, I don't think that it's really a good thing for the format to have. I mean, at the end of the day, this basically says we're going to have the emergency ban windows, quote unquote, whenever a new set comes out, like within 3 weeks, but we only have one structured ban announcement, and we're not really going to try to utilize the post new set ones unless we've like really messed something up, like a Nadu situation going forward, right? When standard is the largest it's ever been, which is something that all of the commentators were reminding us of on the Pro Tour very recently, which I think may have been like a selling point for WotC in general, which I kind of agree with people more like Jerry T or Ross Miriam, where like the size of standard I think is more problematic than a selling point, and I like the rotation aspect of it better. But with 3 years for a set, 5 years of foundations, 1 ban a year, or wait till a new set comes out, NG, Wizards NG, I'm not a huge fan of that. The size of the card pool actually kind of hurts the diversity of the format. Now, there's a couple of like different angles you could like use this in, and I know that a lot of people say that a smaller card pool is going to be more restrictive because you have less answers and everything. However, I think a larger card pool does a couple of different things. First off, the mana is extremely good because of this. Pain lands, Verges, fast lands, and now we're going to be getting shock lands in Edge of Eternity. Some of these cards are going to wind up rotating, but still, the shock lands will just come in and replace those pain lands or some of those fast lands that we're missing, and then boom, the mana is still extremely, extremely good, which means that you can run low mana impactful cards, specifically cards from different colors in your mono or almost mono color deck, like Gruul Aggro used to do, or Is It Prowess does right now, to make your deck extremely efficient. So that means that finding answers within the card pool is like not as useful anymore, because you are just going to be dealing with the fact that like, okay, let's say you find like a sweeper effect that is very good against the prowess deck or the mono red deck or something, like an Ultima type effect. Well, you wind up getting spell pierced, or your Day of Judgment gets spell pierced because that's an effective 1 blue mana card that your opponent can now leave their red blue land up for while they've just played mono red cards or majority red cards like Cori-Steel Cutter, Monastery, Swift Spear, and you know, a Slick Shot Show Off or something, or a Burst Lightning, and now they have a Spell Pierce that's there to deal with the thing that you were playing to deal with that part of the deck. So you wind up having these low mana, too efficient answers that are splashable in different decks, and it also winds up leading to like certain cards at certain mana costs feeling soft banned due to like the overall speed of the format. Not like the aggressive decks attacking you in, but these converted mana costs that are extremely, extremely low. It's one of the big selling points for things like Modern, where you have these cheap, effective, interactive, or powerful spells at low mana costs, and you have fetch lands that mean you could basically splash a Leyline Binding in a 5-color deck, reduce the mana cost by it, and like do something really cool and like blow somebody out with that type of effect, right? Or you can splash like a singleton or 2 copies of a Breeding Pool in an Is It deck so that you can run like a Pick Your Poison type effect to deal with something that might be trying to hate you out, right? So Standard kind of feels like it's in that area right now, when I think Standard was more thriving when you couldn't necessarily do things like that because of the size of the card pool being smaller and more sets rotating out, so that these 3-year-old cards didn't run into these brand new cards for synergies that would wind up lasting for the remainder of the year, which, you know, Cori-Steel Cutter came out at the beginning of the year. You're going to have this synergies with these cards until the end of 2025, basically, in the future. So that's just how the rotation works now. So that, you know, you get a full year of having to deal with it without these emergency ban windows or anything. I also kind of feel like the lack of a block structure anymore. And this was, I know I loved blocks. I loved having multiple things set on a plane. I loved having them even just when they're on different planes or things like that, just kind of fitting together better, or Magic Origins kind of fitting in the middle as this core set with all these different mechanics. But block structure means that things like Kindred themed decks are all crammed into one set because we're never going to visit that plane again, and you need to get all the cards in there that you could potentially play now, because you have things like the mice from Bloomborough. That obviously worked wonders for Standard. But when's the next time we're going to see a mouse? We went past Eldraine that had mice, and I don't think there's going to be very many mice cards in Avatar, maybe in Avatar, or Spider-Man, unless you have like the New York City sewer rats or something, right? But even then, they're probably going to be rats, like, you know, some of the ones that we saw in Final Fantasy. But like one of the things here is goblins. Goblins got cards in Foundations. Goblins got cards in Aether Drift. But you're getting like one goblin here, one goblin there, maybe two in a set. But they're missing pieces to be a cohesive deck. Whereas if we were in a block structure and we were in Tarkir again, we would have goblins every single set, and eventually a deck would be made, and you could play it for, you know, 2 years or something after it fully came to fruition. You could build it slowly over time and see how the iterations would work. But, you know, goblins probably aren't going to see any of their missing pieces printed anytime soon, because maybe you get Green Goblin in Spider-Man and there's no goblins that are going to be in the Avatar set. So with all of these Universes Beyond sets, these Kindred themed decks are basically DOA as soon as that set is passed by, and you don't wind up having, you know, the other 25% of the deck you need to play. So I would love to see Standard have no fixed ban dates outside of set releases. It's the only rotating format of Magic, so it doesn't really hurt as bad if an emergency banning pops up as it does as like Modern or Pioneer or like even Legacy, where people have to invest a lot of money into these formats. And even then, like, the ban windows that are used after a new set comes out function as like these emergency bans for the format already. So you have precedent for it. You have these timing windows. I just think that if you wind up seeing, you know, 2 months of Monstrous Rage completely dominating a format, maybe you step in and do something if all of these pro level events and high level events are having a hard time dealing with it. So that's how I would address the way that Standard works. I think that you need to go back to a shorter rotation. I think you need emergency ban windows, and whether you keep the one ban announcement a year or not is entirely on you, Wizards. I don't think you need to keep the date there if you have emergency ban windows. And I would just love to see, I know we're never going back to blocks, but I would love to see more synergy between sets, whether it's planes that are closely related or mechanics across sets back to back, so that you can actually build a cohesive Standard deck around a theme rather than the power level of a card. And before we wrap up the video for today, I do want to give a shout out to the next couple of Standard events that are coming up, because things are going to look a little weird. We have the Magic Spotlight series in Chiba, Japan, which is coming up this weekend. So maybe you're watching this video by the time the tournament is actually on, as well as the Magic Spotlight series in Orlando, Florida, which happens in the last weekend of August, which is, you know, the 29th to the 31st or something like that. But like I said, Chiba is this weekend. So what I'm expecting is a very similar Pro Tour meta, most likely. However, I'm expecting a lot more mono red and decks that are good against mono red. Not just because a Japanese player won Pro Tour Final Fantasy, but the deck had like a 60% win rate overall. So like everybody who wants to try to win is going to be picking up that deck or gunning against that deck instead of the prowess decks now. And No, Prowess and Mono Red with overlapping cards have different play patterns. You can't just play a answer all to both of those decks. That's why Azorius Control had like an 80-something% win rate against Is It Prowess and like a 12% win rate against Mono Red or something like that this past week. Go watch my Pro Tour Final Fantasy recap video. It has all those numbers in there. I haven't memorized them. I read them off of the Google sheet that I have, and they're on the video too. But I'm also expecting a little bit more Dimir or Esper style decks, but that's a little bit more based on the fact that Japanese players have historically liked playing these kinds of decks. Blue-Black Fairies is still a very kind of like popular archetype, or like that tempo style of deck just kind of fits in with the overall metagame from what I've seen like for years and years of play from like that region specifically. So Dimir mid-range, I'm expecting to see a little bit more. Esper Pixie, which is pretty good into Mono Red, I'm expecting to see a little bit more. Maybe even the Orzhov version too, because Orzhov struggled a little bit against Prowess at this specific event, but was still pretty decent into the Mono Red decks. Whereas Magic Spotlight Series in Orlando, it's Edge of Eternities, and it happens after rotation. So it also happens way after the ban window. So things here are gonna look way, way different. Like very, very different than any of the other events that have occurred before it. With bans and rotation, it's gonna be ripe for experimentation. So I am really looking forward to the Magic Spotlight Series in Orlando, because that is going to be one where we basically will see whatever new decks people have come up with. There's like 3 weeks of Magic the Gathering online play, and I'm sure that people are going to have testing teams, because this is like an event where if you do well, you qualify for things too. So they're probably going to have testing teams keeping things a little bit more hush-hush, a little bit more secret, and I think that is going to be a little more exciting to see debuts of decks, so long as Edge of Eternities shakes things up a little bit. The bans that are going to be coming out shake things up a little bit. So depending on what stays around in Standard, you kind of have an idea of what may be popping up going in, and then be like completely surprised by something, or things may look completely fresh and new, like I think they should after a rotation. But anyway, let me know in the comments down below what you think is going to be popping up at Chiba, or what you're excited for seeing at the Magic Spotlight Series in Orlando. Of course, you could also discuss how you think my bans theory plays out. I'm on just Monstrous Rage. A lot of you are going to disagree with that, but let me know in the comments down below. We'll chat it out, and like civil human beings, like most comment sections are, right? Hopefully. Speaking of civil human beings, if you are down there, and you can click the thumbs up on the video, so you know the YouTube algorithm gods know that you've liked this, regardless of you agreeing my opinion or not. But like civil human beings, you can click the join button down below to become one of my members, like these civil human beings. Now, these people over here not only monetarily support the channel to make this video and all of the videos on my channel possible through their support, but they get member benefits like getting early access to this video and getting early access to any sort of content that I make, including written posts and deck text that I do. You can get Discord access where you can post your deck list and we can chat about it while I'm sleepy at 6 a.m. because that's when my job has me wake up nowadays, and I could talk about my your deck with you instead of doing my job. But regardless of that, if you are so inclined, you can click that join button down below the video or on my home channel page to show your devotion. As always, I'd love it if you could just tap that subscribe button, because it helps me, but it also helps you stay up to date on all my latest deck techs, metagame analysis, I guess ban discourse, and just in general, Magic content. See you for the Chiba recap.